Hey, I got a bone to pick with you.
What?
You put a bunch of videos on YouTube that were just you, and they didn't have me and Aaron in them.
What's this guy's fault?
That guy's fault? Oh, because he got married, you have to put solo videos up. Well, in those videos, there were some points that I felt like the videos would have been a lot better if I were talking in them.
Hold on, guys. Let me get my bag of chips here real quick.
So we'll do a response to some of your claims about the one true church, the spiritual and invisible church, and like what's the significance of that, because you were just wrong about all of it. So we'll try to to clear the record here.
I disagree.
Well, then this should be good.
Welcome to The Sacred Life. I'm your host, Aaron Beachy, coming to you from the tree-infested rolling hills of Indiana.
Infested? What a nasty thing to say about trees.
We have with us again today John Baylor and David Baylor. Make sure I get it out there right.
I guess I'm David now.
David Baver.
Today we are picking bones with each other, I guess.
Oh, man.
So
just with him.
No, we're glad to have you back today, and this is just kind of a little bit of a recap video of some of the solo discussions that David shared with all of you.
Well, I wouldn't call it a recap video, although we'll start with a little bit of that. So if you haven't watched the other videos, then don't watch them. It's just David.
Wait. Watch them.
But we will start with, if you guys are interested in the recap, then watch them. But we'll start with David giving a little bit of recap. So if you haven't watched them, it will be no big deal.
Yeah.
But
an extension of the discussion.
Yeah, right. An extension of it, because the recap is just to set up the discussion that we'll do here.
So then I guess, John, what's your problem?
Oh, well, mostly, no, I told David, boy, I thought he's at his best when I'm pushing on him. Mm-hmm. And so there were a few points that I would have liked to have pushed on a little bit, and then I know you'd commented there were a couple things that you felt like you wish that you had been a part of the conversation as well. Right. So again, we'll just have an extension of the discussion. Right. There may be a little bit of arguing going on here. I was going to say, but it won't get violent. But now I don't know. But anyways, we'll start with turning to David just to say what were some of the main ideas that you covered in your solo videos?
So the main overarching point is the question of authority. How does authority work, and how does that relate to questions like how you interpret Scripture, or who even has the authority to interpret Scripture, and like how does that play out in how you structure the church, how you structure your Christianity, and then how does that reverberate into the world? I mean, that's kind of a broad concept. That's why it took 4 videos to go through it all. And then there's like a lot of other points that relate to that, like what is the nature of good and evil? How does the spiritual relate to that, like angels and demons and their nature? I don't know. That's kind of a very general summary.
Okay, so I'll direct you toward a couple of points. Then the one true church, or the idea that the church is not divided. Mm-hmm. As opposed to this idea of the spiritual or invisible church. Can you kind of sum up that part of it?
I think the real quick summary I would make is that the nature of the church as the body of the Christ necessitates that it can't be divided. If you think of like what's symbolized in the body, but then also think about like how does that actually function in the real world. I guess I would argue that the idea of the church as a spiritual entity and not as an earthly institution is one that actually doesn't work in the real world, and is like behind a lot of problems that we see in the world around us. So it's one that in my estimation deserves criticism, because I feel that it's a potentially dangerous way of thinking.
Okay, so in terms of this, then this is where I would come in and say, like, as far as the way that I perceive things, the idea that the spiritual church is the real church the idea that that the church is not an earthly institution, but is a type of spiritual unity of believers. I think the farthest I could go would be to say that there would be a flawed way of thinking that, which would be a total dismissal of the significance of an earthly institution.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I would also think that there is something in that idea of the invisible church that remains indispensable.
Well, I think depending on how far you take that, I would agree, and I think most traditional Christians would agree, because nobody's out there making the claim that I guess you would say the visible church, the visible institutions are flawless. And even like Roman Catholic claims about infallibility, like infallibility in English is an often confusing term that doesn't mean what most people think it means, or like it's not the concept behind the word as it's used in Roman Catholicism, which I'm not an apologist for Roman Catholicism by any means. It's just be fair in your criticisms of somebody, like actually have accurate criticisms. And like infallibility in their estimation, like doesn't mean the church is perfect and everything that it does and says is perfect. Although, like from my standpoint, maybe they come too close to saying that at times. But yeah, so like nobody's making the claim really, and I'm certainly not making the claim that the earthly visible institution of the church is right in everything that it says and does, and it is the perfect institution of Christ's church on earth. Like instead, like I would certainly say, no, the bishops are often wrong, but you have to be very careful about how you deal with that. You can't be careless with that kind of thing. You can't take that to the extent that, oh, the bishops are wrong about this, so that means the entire institution is invalid. Like that's a massive overreaction to a real problem.
Well, that would also not be compatible with Jesus' teaching.
Mm-hmm. But it is the reaction that a lot of people had in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I say because that might sound like a bold claim,
mm-hmm.
but Jesus says to honor the Pharisees that are sitting in Moses' seat, not because of what they do, but because of the seat.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's kind of like at the center of my argument is that, look, this is the seat of the apostles, who are esteemed even higher than Moses, and I can't just disregard that.
Mm-hmm.
I can't just say, oh, you know what, they're wrong right now, so I'm just going to go over here and do my own thing. Like, my point with that is there's so much danger in that outweighs the danger of what you're reacting against.
Okay. Now, so my biggest beef with you, or I don't know if I would call it a beef so much as like a deep-seated hatred.
Yeah, it's mutual. Go on.
is not this idea of that belief in the importance of the institutional church would somehow mean that institutional church would be flawless. I think that's a kind of like easy criticism to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason that I say I think that some kind of notion of the invisible and spiritual church is necessary is because now there might be other points I could make along this way, but a simple way of illustrating would be to say if let's say some dictator takes over the country,
mm-hmm.
And Christianity is outlawed and Christians are being killed all over the place, and I go and live in hiding in this infestation of trees out here, then I'm practicing my faith in total isolation.
Right.
And there exists somewhere in the world, we'll just say an institutional church. Then now I'm already being simplistic, because you could say like, well, there are actually multiple institutions that are not institutionally united, and I think it's difficult to say, well, one of them must be the true one and the other ones must not be the true one in some way. But
mm-hmm.
but that's a different discussion. So right now, for my example, we'll just say there's one true church out there somewhere, but I'm living and hiding in the woods. I'm not a part of that one institutional church. But to say that like I'm not a part of the church, I would say there's a sense in which that's an earthly reality and not a spiritual reality.
Right,
That
I think
I am a part of an invisible and spiritual church.
Yeah, and I would agree. So the question then becomes one of individual versus societal or collective, and also one of time. So like if your descendants generations from now continue disconnected from the institutional church, there's not the, I don't know, I guess you would say the sort of grace that you have. So like part of the necessity for the institution of the church is that, now this is hard to work out because you might argue, oh, this doesn't always work the way you say it does, and yeah, I'll concede it doesn't always work out perfectly, but over the span of time I think it does. And like that's the important thing, is distinguishing between the moment and the broader scope of history. But if I, for example, am in an institution that has fallen into error, and I separate off and start a house church, and chances are I'm just going to surround myself with people that have the same ideological bent, at least on the central things that I do. Like there might be a small degree of diversity, but it's not going to be very high. Like history, all the examples we have around us demonstrate that that's true. You're gonna conglomerate together with those that agree with you. And if you have an institution of a church that sees itself as one singular body, you don't have that. You are united in communion with people you disagree with. And we, in our modern rational minds, might see that as a weakness, but it's actually a necessity. Like I'm arguing that that's a necessity. It is absolutely necessary that, let's just reduce it to the political realm, that I am in the same church with people who have different political opinions than I do. Because following that example, if everybody in my church has the same general political bent, then that becomes part of your religion.
Oh, so this would be like where the belief in the spiritual and individual church would become problematic.
Yeah.
But like I'm hesitant to say that because I have a belief in the spiritual and invisible church. But
yes.
It's like of a particular type. Because if
yes.
you take it in this direction that you're hinting at now, then when there is conflict within the church, when there's ideological conflict, when there's political conflict, or even theological conflict, then you can easily justify splitting the church.
Right.
Because you can say, look, it's no big deal because there's no such thing as the institutional church, so we can split this thing as much as we want, and we'll still be part of the true invisible church. So,
right.
So who cares? There are no consequences to this kind of real world division that
we're
participating in.
But there ends up, if I'm looking, if I reduce it back to the level of the individual, the problem is there ends up being nothing to rein me in as an individual. Because now I can justify any disagreement I have, and I can find other people that agree with me, and I can go unite myself with them.
Yeah.
But
or even if you don't, then you can also say, you know what, I just can't find anybody that I agree with, but as an individual, I can just split off from everybody else, and I can be my own church.
Right.
And I can be, maybe we throw around the phrase spiritual, but not religious too much, but like, I can move totally away from the institutional religion, because the institutional religion is not in any deep sense real or true, and I can be on my own in total isolation and still be a part of the individual or the invisible spiritual church.
Right.
But I mean, in my earlier example, that's what I was doing anyways, of necessity. I was in the woods because
right.
all my fellow Christians had been killed, and I'm living on the run. So like, it's not that it's impossible to be a Christian and to be in isolation, but yet like to be a Christian and to choose isolation.
Right.
I mean, even then you have the tradition of hermits, you know, like there's a type of isolation that you can choose, but a hermit, I don't think you choose to become a hermit because of the belief that like the church is all wrong and there's I reject the institution that exists and it's meaningless anyways.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's an important distinction you just made, John. It's like the approach of isolation, like it matters. Like,
Yeah.
you know, if I'm going to go out on my own and say, well, you know, everyone else is wrong, so this is what I'm going to, you know, basically I'm the church.
Yeah, right.
And no one else is.
Right.
Yeah, and that's the extreme. The extreme is I'm the church, but a lesser version would be like, well, look, the three of us will meet together and we'll have our church and we'll be the church.
Yeah.
But that's just a difference in scale. But
Right.
I mean, at least that involves some degree of community.
There's actually like even a place for something like that within the church, though, because so you have examples like the Desert Fathers, who like see the necessity for, you know, persecution has stopped, and there's a real danger without persecution of the church becoming lax, you know, the church becoming too comfortable. And you know, there are these men that have the desire to separate themselves off from people they see as getting too comfortable in their faith. And so like there is this sort of separation that happens, but they still see themselves as in communion with those other people, as part of the same body. And like that's I don't know, like it's really complicated, and I think that's the best way I would describe the modern situation. Is it's like it's really complicated and confusing, and oftentimes there's not like a clear delineation that happens.
Yeah, right.
But
I mean, in some sense, like I say, I believe in something that you would call the spiritual or invisible church,
well, so do I. But the point is, that's not the only thing there is. Like there is both the you know. So traditionally, you might say there's the church militant and the church triumphant, and there the idea is there is the church that is embodied here on earth, and then there's also you are in communion with the saints who are with God.
Yeah.
But that's actually a very important concept. Because part of my concept of the spiritual church is not only am I united with the believers alive right now, but I'm also united with the believers past and future. Like I'm in a communion with them.
Yeah, it is also a tendency, like if you would think of the Protestants are the ones who are most interested in this idea of like, hey, if we disagree, let's split off and let's make our own church. And we can go ahead and break this earthly connection because what matters is the spiritual connection.
Right.
And yet the groups that are undergoing all that division are also less interested in the idea of communion with the departed saints.
Right.
To add to what you just described there, John, the prevalent way of looking at things being, well, we disagree on, well, maybe you could put it this way, we disagree on too much, or we have too many personal grievances amongst our group, so we need to separate. I think one of the biggest problems that arises from that is actually thinking that a physical separation means we're not still connected as quote unquote believers or the church. Like,
Right.
and I say that because knowing
You
that
could think of like if we make that split, then it's like we're still married, but we don't talk to each other anymore. It's like, to think that we're not in relationship is false, but we're just not in a good relationship.
People oftentimes will function as if it is true. Like, we'll function as if we aren't in connection anymore in any way, shape, or form. And I say that knowing that you do yourself a disservice by approaching it that way, because I've gone through it before myself. And to approach it as if you are not in any way connected to, you know, I'll just say the people on the other side of the split, it's not, you are. And a part of you in many ways is still in that place. And maybe you can't do anything about it, and maybe there's not a way you can see actually doing anything about it, but to not acknowledge that in the very least is not good.
Yeah. Well, so there's two things, I guess, that inform my thinking on this and lead me to the place that I am now. So it'd be like, first, just being really bothered by the disunity in especially American Christianity today. Like it seems that in my lifetime this has only accelerated. Mm-hmm. That things are just becoming more and more fractal. Mm-hmm. Down to where it's become almost an entirely individualized Christianity. Like everybody, I don't know, you hear this claim often that Protestants rejected the Pope and it ended up everybody becoming his own Pope. And the statement there is everybody puts himself in the place of authority when it comes to biblical interpretation. And you really see that, like people really elevate this idea of, I need to be understanding and interpreting the scripture. And so I'm really bothered by the disunity that I see and asking the question. I've been asking this question, you guys both know this, for a long time. What can we do about the disunity that exists in the church? What is the answer to this? How can there be some kind of unity? And that ultimately leads me to the position that I am right now, which is, well, I really think the only way that's ever going to happen is by acknowledging that there actually is an institution that Christ established, and that is his church, and it might not be perfect in its manifestation in our lifetime, but that doesn't justify us going off and doing our own thing, because that pretty clearly hasn't worked. There's all kinds of places you can go with that. That's a really complicated idea. And then the other thing is, okay, so I recognize in myself that I don't know everything. And, just using those 4 videos I did by myself, I always have in the back of my mind this idea that, well, I don't have the authority to be telling people how it is, because I don't have perfect knowledge of these things. I don't have perfect knowledge. I don't have perfect understanding of these things. I know that I'm wrong about things, but the thing is, I don't know which things I'm wrong about. And then I can extend that also. You might say, oh, well, the answer to that then is to submit yourself to the body of believers around you. It's like, okay, but I actually still haven't escaped that problem. Because how do I know that the people around me aren't making the same... Like, if I just extend that out to my local body of believers, my congregation, then there's still the problem that there's a certain ideology prevalent here, and how do I know if it's right or not? Because what larger network, I myself need a larger network of Christians to kind of submit my understanding of things to, but so does the group of people I'm a part of immediately. And that this works itself out in a hierarchy. And for me, it's like once I understand that everything actually functions in a hierarchy, I realize the necessity of actually operating within a hierarchy.
Okay, so I think that's a good line of thinking. My mind goes kind of the same direction, where before I was one guy out existing in my own isolated church, mm-hmm. because I was living in hiding. With my local community, and this is more of a historical issue than a modern issue, but I could have something similar where I'm just like, my community is in the hills of Switzerland, in the Oberland, and we have very little contact with other people in outside regions.
Yeah.
And you might say that there's still a sense in which they are, in real life, practical terms, connected to the larger church.
Right.
But that connection is really, really loose. And it's not that often that they see a priest from the outside world, or that they have connection to the outside world. Mm-hmm. So you have this this local congregation does exist within a broader system and a broader hierarchy, but the practical reality of that is really, really loose. And I don't think that it would be right to say that that's some kind of evil, or like, well, in a better world, these isolated people that live up in the mountains would just be more plugged in, because it's like, well, in what better world? I mean, like, and again, I'm talking historically, so I'm not so much talking about everyday reality today, but like historically speaking, like everyday reality is like, well, this is what reality is like. We're not that connected, and we can still have a really rich faith,
right?
Even with a really loose connection.
Yeah, and that kind of works if you have a faith that's centered on liturgy, basically, on the liturgical life. Because
I think in general that's an answer to a lot of these questions about division. Because if your faith is centered around the pastor going up and preaching his position on things, and that's the centerpiece of your religious experience, then if you disagree with what the pastor is saying, then that's a big problem.
You're right.
And like, what I don't know what you're supposed to do if that's what religious experience is all about, is listening to the pastor preach, and you think like, this guy's wrong about this and this and this, and like, it really bothers me when he says things in this way.
Well, then you just need to go to another church.
Well, I mean, but that's sort of like,
that's what happens.
Right. And you could say, like, it's hard to say that's a problem. You shouldn't be going to another church, because it's like, what, I'm supposed to spend my whole life just listening to things that I don't agree with, and being annoyed by by this guy's perspective on things. I mean, in some way, it seems like a lot of the conversation has suggested that the answer to that question is, well, yes, you should just sit there and endure it, even if you think it's the wrong way of looking at things. And you should subject your children to it, even if you think it's going to pollute them, ruin their way of thinking.
It's like, in contrast to that, like my church, there's a 2-hour service, and maybe 10 minutes of it is preaching.
Yeah, right. I mean, that is the alternative. Is like, well, if your religious experience was based on to connect to our recent discussion, if your religious experience is based on connection to the story, is based on participation in the story, instead of being based on somebody speaking his philosophical and theological positions, then that type of intellectual division isn't going to rule the day.
Yeah. So the real idea that's at the center, and I didn't bring this out in my solo videos, and this is a good thing to bring out in group discussion, because the reason I didn't bring it out in my solo videos, because it's like, I don't know how to bring it out if it's just me talking. But if there's 3 of us, I think we can actually get to the point I'm trying to make, which is that the central idea in the body of Christ is actually the table where you share your common meal, and this divine feast, the Eucharist, the communion table, is it is the place where the church is functionally united. And so, like, the weird to us, I don't know, the things that are to like Protestant Christians, the weird debates of early Christianity and the ecumenical councils are actually centered on the question of the liturgy and communion. It's like, what actually is our communion? What actually is our liturgy? Because it's this participation. Are we participating in the same thing or not? Because if we're not, then we're not united. And so to say you are anathema, or to say you are excommunicated because you're teaching this, is not like the church acting on its own authority to say, we have decided that you are not in communion with us. It's rather the church recognizing, look, because you are not celebrating the same story as us, we are functionally not united. We have ceased to be united in this in this table, in this feast. And so like there's all kinds of ways that works out, but really when it comes to unity in the faith, it's that's what it looks like. It's not, I'm not totally discounting doctrine and teaching, but I'm saying doctrine and teaching is a lot less important than you think it is. What's more important is, going back to our previous video, is the story that you're participating in. So like that's what the real body of Christ is it's the institution that's united in telling the same story and participating in the same story, and also defending that faith and upholding it, preserving it intact and unchanged. So like that's my vision when I'm talking about the institution of the church. I'm not really talking about a bunch of bishops sitting around and making decisions. I'm talking about the thing that I was just saying.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like there's almost this sense in which the bishops and the hierarchy of the church is like, it is a real thing, but it's also a symbol of the thing that's even more real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the this will shift the subject a little bit, unless you wanted to make any addition there.
No.
Okay. Another part of this discussion is the idea of okay, well, what is this institution? If we say, like, if we can concede, okay, there is something that really matters that's called the spiritual or invisible church, but that doesn't mean that we can neglect the idea of the institutional church,
right?
Because well, I mean, for a lot of reasons, there's a lot of reasons we can't neglect the institutional church. One is if we neglect the institutional church, then what we wind up with in reality is division within the church, and the division in the church leads to division in the society, and we have a worse world, and a world where people are more hostile to each other, in part because we don't view the institution of the church as being important.
Yeah. So
we'll just let things fall apart religiously and then just expect them to work out in secular society and have people united in secular society. Well, that's not functional. That's not going to work.
Yeah, and I would say that's an extension of one of the concepts I was trying to bring out, which is that if you think that things can exist only as a spiritual concept, then you really have a religion other than Christianity.
Yeah,
because it is actually
not an incarnational idea.
Yeah, right. It is absolutely necessary that we understand that our spiritual concepts aren't just abstract theoretical ideas that exist in heaven, but they have to be manifest on the earth, or they're just not real.
Mm-hmm, right.
Like in the
well, and that's like heaven itself must be manifest on the earth.
Well, yeah. So it's like, okay, you're going to say the true church is spiritual and exists in heaven. It's like, okay, what does Jesus Christ himself say, though? He says, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's telling you, the kingdom of heaven is, because I'm here, Jesus saying this, the kingdom of heaven is becoming manifest on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not disconnected from your lived experience.
If you want to say, like, what's a definition of the gospel, then it's like, well, the message that Jesus went around preaching was the kingdom of heaven is at hand.
Right. Yeah, and like he's always drawing out these illustrations of the kingdom of heaven, but in like this very real and present sense.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it's like I've always got that impression from his illustrations about the kingdom of heaven, is that he's saying, like, this is a thing that it's not just an abstract idea.
Right. It's not a far-off thing.
Yeah, it's not a far-off thing. It's something that is manifest. And this is something like early Christianity sees as, like, this is, like, early Christian evangelism is not modern evangelism. It's not going out and winning souls for Christ. It's making the kingdom of heaven manifest on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why
yeah, you can, like, in terms of discussions of beauty and art and all that, it's like why would you have a church be something that's beautiful? It's, well, like, if you're trying to figure out, my mission in life is to make the kingdom of heaven manifest on earth, how am I supposed to do that? Then beauty is not the only answer, but beauty is an answer to that question.
Yeah, and it's a pretty important part.
It is. It's like to drive through some little town and see, I've mentioned this on our conversations before, I'm sure, but like see some old church that's been there for 150 years or something that's like just a really nice looking church, then there's something that's like the best building in the whole town, and like we don't have a lot of nice buildings in America in general, you know. So like when you come across one, it's something special. But to think like, wow, this means something, that this beautiful building has stood here for 150 years in this little town where there are no beautiful buildings. It's like there's something uplifting in this realization. Like that's something that calls you into a higher way of living, is just the beauty of the place.
Right. Yeah. And it's like there's also this sense in which beauty and art are like the manifestations of something.
And so to go back to institutions, then we would say, like, if you're trying to see how is it that I can bring the kingdom of heaven into earth, then it would be a kind of a weird answer to say, like, I know I'll break away from my existing church, and then we'll have two churches where there are families divided against each other,
right.
And people that are going to hold hostilities that will last for generations. That's how I'll bring the kingdom of heaven to this earth. So that idea of I'm going to pursue the kingdom of heaven by this practical division that's going to leave scars on a community is like, that doesn't seem like a very good way to bring the kingdom of heaven into earth.
Yeah.
It does seem to make sense that you would say, like, how am I going to bring the kingdom of heaven into earth through the church? There is a sense in which a kind of unity, institutional, visible unity, practical unity, is part of that.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, that's again, like I keep saying, this idea of the spiritual invisible church is important, but if you throw out the idea of the institutional church altogether and you say, look, that's not really anything, that's just imaginary. There is no true visible church. The only true church is the invisible church. But that seems like you have to have both of those things, and if you move too far into the spiritual invisible, then like it means you can no longer bring the kingdom of heaven into earth through institutions.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, I guess for somebody on the other side of the argument, they would say, like, well, that's not how you bring the kingdom of heaven into earth. It's not through institutions. But it's like, well, you're bringing something into earth. You're bringing some kind of kingdom into earth through division.
Right. Yeah. Correct. And like the question that was coming to my mind is like, well, the word division is actually related to the word devil.
Mm-hmm.
And like the word devil, I think we've said this before, diavolos is the Greek word. It literally means division.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the spirit of division is the devil, quite literally.
Yeah, right.
So it's like, and that was a point I was making as well. It's like, okay, if the character of your system of belief is that it causes division, you have to step back and ask, what spirit is working then?
Yeah.
Because if it's a spirit of division, then it is quite literally the devil, or it is a devil, I should say.
Okay, I need to get back to arguing against you because I find myself too much in agreement lately.
I told you I would win.
But, no, this is all basically what my position isn't really changing on any of these things.
What?
But I'm trying to say, like, between these, you know, I mean, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is God is the God of all things visible and invisible.
Right.
And it's a mistake to say that the invisible is not there and is not part of the vision of the church.
Right.
And again, I think that's an indispensable necessity and an indispensable part of Christianity. And the visible is also necessary. And if you don't have the visible, then again, it seems to me like you're bringing another spirit into the world besides the Spirit of God.
Right.
By your anti-authoritarian approach to religion.
Mm-hmm.
But to argue against you some more, like, then I want to move to this idea of like this idea of the one true church. So if we talk about the institution as being something important, then we're kind of like the puzzle to solve is to figure out, okay, so there's all these churches that are visibly institutionally divided from one another. Which is the one true church that I could be a part of? And there are a few dangers involved with that, and one is that you're going to pick one to be the one true church, and all the others are going to be wrong.
Right.
And if that is your approach, then you're still participating in a spirit of division.
Yeah.
And I'll go ahead and mention, like, specifically, we've got lots of Orthodox people viewing the channel, and we've had like a Orthodox priest that warn us, like, don't listen too much to what the gung-ho Orthodox online people have to say. You will have a lot of these online Orthodox people who have a very exclusive mentality,
Right.
and a lot of them are recent converts. A lot of them are the kind of internet Orthodox people that haven't been a part of a community for a long time. But you'll have this argument that will come from these people that will say, like, look, this is the one true church, and you guys are just schismatic, and your ancestors are heretics, and all these kind of,
Right.
like, I mean, we've got those kind of comments on the channel.
Yeah.
Well, I read a comment like that, and I said, like, look, you could have said the same thing when you were a Baptist.
Right.
You could have been just as exclusionary then. And the only difference now is, like, now you're a part of a different religion and you feel like you've got a better justification, but it's the same exclusive mindset.
Yeah, I mean,
the same spirit of division that you had before.
You even have like figures like Gavin Ortlund going out there and saying, okay, this is what the Orthodox Church teaches. If you convert to Orthodoxy, then you have to say all of your ancestors are going to hell, and all of your family members are going to hell because they're not part of the one true church. It's like, okay, stop. No. That's what some really fringe elements teach, and you might even find a saint or two who said something kind of, who might have personally thought something kind of like that. But that's not what the church believes. There also might have been this point in like the 18th century where you can find some official documents that say things like that. Okay, you should point out the 18th century was a low point in Orthodox theology where they were basically using either Lutheran or Catholic theology. So, like, don't base anything on that. All that aside, it's like that's not actually what and I think this is where you're going. Like, that's not actually what Orthodox Catholic or Roman Catholicism.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sort of saying that. I mean, I'm not making a specific argument about like what is it that the Orthodox actually teach, but I am trying to say, like, this is a way of looking at this question that we're talking about.
Yeah,
and
I'm just
it
pointing
is a really
out,
flawed way.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, it's appropriate to bring in.
Right, and I'm just pointing out, like, the official position of the Orthodox Church is that is a flawed way of thinking, like going all the way back, like as far as you can go. And so we'll use the example again of St. Basil the Great, who says, I don't know whether the heterodox are saved or not. It's not my place to judge. Like, instead, what he would say, and what so many throughout the history of the church has said, is basically this idea that this is the normative way, and this is the institution that Christ established. And
right, and if you're the guy that's you got your own church out in the woods somewhere, then I think you can safely say, like, this is not the normative way.
Yeah.
This is not the ideal that my brothers in Christ that lived in this community have been killed, and now I'm living on the run.
Yeah.
And I'm worshiping in isolation. Like, I think it's really easy to say, like, this is not the ideal.
Yeah, and I think this is something like that confuses a lot of Protestants, and it's something that's very foreign to their concept, their way of thinking, is that Orthodox Christianity and like the ancient church fathers, they have this quality where they refuse to put any limitation on God. And that includes saying only people in our church can be saved.
Yeah,
because that would be seen as limiting
a major
God.
limitation.
Right.
Right.
And they say, like, well, we don't know. God can save who he chooses to save. And he never bothers to tell us who that is.
Yeah.
Like, instead, he's like, the Orthodox way of thinking is this church, and this I guess you would say version of the faith is the one that's best for the world. And that's why you should be interested in it. Not because it's some necessity if you don't do this, you're going to hell. It's more, and like even like my criticisms of Protestantism are, oh, all you Protestants are going to hell because you're heretics. It's like, no, I just think that your ideas are bad for you and they're bad for the world around you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not that they're condemning you, it's that they're not accomplishing what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, that's a fair way to put it.
Right.
That's the appropriate way to put it.
Mm-hmm. And so, like, when it comes down to the question of what is the true faith, to me, that's what the question is okay, which is actually...
And to say that, to clarify the true faith, that means, again, with this idea of spiritual invisible church versus the institutional visible church, then in this sense, when you're saying the one true faith, you're talking about which is the one true visible institutional church.
Yeah, right. So if you're a modern Christian that has this individualized way of thinking, like, it's abhorrent to you to say that, okay, the Roman Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity, and because he does this, and because Theodosius 70 years later outlaws paganism, because of these things, all of the individuals are compelled, basically, over the course of time to become Christian, and they're not coming to this by their own choice. It's like, yeah, maybe you can make some arguments there, but they stopped murdering each other for entertainment. They stopped pillaging the world for their own benefit. They stopped these, like, horrible displays of debauchery, public debauchery. They stopped these bloody pagan sacrifices. They stopped, like, this bloody system that dominated their culture for thousands of years. Like, that all stopped because of this. So, like, are you telling me that this is not better for the world? Like, ultimately it comes like, the question comes down to that. It's like, are you arguing at this very abstract theoretical level of the individual, or are you zooming out and saying, but what's actually better for mankind? What's actually better for the human race? What's actually better for our world? And I would argue that the individualism in Western Christianity has flipped the script to where, for 1,500 years of history, Christianity was always being attacked from the outside, from the pagans, from the Muslims, and all of these groups external, but generally, as a trend, Christianity was winning. It was winning the world to Christ and his church. But since the 1500s, the enemy has become ourselves, and we're losing. We're like, on the global scale, like, Western culture has pretty much fallen in terms of its moral and religious foundation. It's like, well, why did that happen? It's like, well, because we're so obsessed with ourselves as individuals, and we're not bothering to consider what's good for our society or what's good for the world. We're not really thinking about the salvation of the world anymore, and like, that's a consequence of adopting these really abstract theoretical ideas of the church. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but they go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the reason, to move backward a little bit, the reason I clarified that when you say the true faith, what we're talking about is what's the true institution, is because, like, I think, to me, that seems like a similar error to saying the institutional church doesn't matter, it's all the spiritual and invisible church.
Right.
It's also, I think, an error to say, like, well, the institutional church is what really matters, and since there are so many institutions, like, there's got to be one of them that's the right one. Like, that seems too much on the other extreme, where there's, like, the total disappearance of the spiritual and invisible. And the problem with that, again, is, like, you have, like, well, then I'm just gonna, what I already mentioned, I'm just gonna join the one true church, and then I'm just gonna be exclusionary and look down on everybody else. To me, if you pick a church and you say, like, this is the best story, we'll say, like, this is the best form of Christianity that there is, and the world will be better if I move into this tradition, if more people move into this tradition. Like, all of that seems okay.
Yeah.
And yet, like, also in my mind, if you move into that institution and into that church, then division in the institutional church does still in reality exist.
Yeah.
And like, you even like, I don't think there's like all churches are guilty of division except for one.
Right.
That division still exists even if you join that church, and there's still separation between institutional separation between you and your brothers in Christ, which is like, it's not fair to just like turn around and say that they're bad because this division exists, because like, well, you exist within it. Like,
I want to like kind of like preempt the Catholic response that's going to come to that statement, which is to say, well, there's not division in the Catholic Church. It's like, I would say yes, there is, but you have sort of this artificial unity superimposed over the top that allows you to kind of pretend that there's not. But I think, like, to everybody on the outside looking in, there's incredible division in Roman Catholicism right now. And then, now I say that, and I have to be fair, like, well, the Eastern Orthodox Church also has like a fairly significant internal schism going on right now between Russia and Constantinople. But so you also have like the counterpoint to that is, okay, let's look at the war in Ukraine. And what I hear from Orthodox people, the biggest like mournful complaint, I guess I would call it, that most people have, is that you have Orthodox Christians fighting Orthodox Christians, and this should never happen. Because like we see ourselves as united in one single brotherhood, one single fellowship. And so for us to be fighting each other is just like the worst of the worst. But in order to perpetuate that conflict, this might like roam a little bit too much towards the political end of thing, but in order to perpetuate that conflict and to justify it, the Ukrainian president has been forced to outlaw the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, because it was a force against, like, because it was standing on that principle that, like, look, we can't be fighting ourselves. And so there is this sense in which actually having, like, in contrast to that, like this might be unfair if my understanding of the scope of history isn't complete enough. I'll concede that. But the contrast to that is what happens with the fallout of the Reformation is religious wars tear the West apart. And like the Holy Roman Empire was previously united by a single religious identity, and like that was the thing that defined you as a German in the Middle Ages, was you were united with this single religious identity. Like, also, yeah, you had a common language and ethnicity, but the Holy Roman Empire included a lot of people that weren't united by language and ethnicity, but they were united in this religious concept. You know, it's not always perfect, but as soon as the Reformation happens, then it just immediately disintegrates, to where within a couple decades, the empire is at war with itself. Like, there's massive, and like even just in the tiny little country of Switzerland, like there's immediately a horrible bloody civil war, and there's like 2 other civil wars that would be fought over the question of religion.
You might be able to make the argument that the reason that the Reformation happened was so that the empire could be at war with itself.
Like, maybe, but the point is that there's a very, very real consequence to seeing the church as not united as a single earthly institution, and that that consequence is quite literally, immediately, extremely bloody and violent warfare. Like, you're not united. You're functionally not, like, you're making this argument that you're united as Christians in this invisible church, but you're killing each other over the question of doctrine. So it's like, you're not united.
Right.
And like, and it's not even as black and white as all the Catholics are fighting all the Protestants. Like, look at the 30 Years' Wars. There's Catholics and Protestants on both sides, even though the original motivation of the war is largely a religious one. So it's like, what's going on? So it's like the period following the Reformation in Europe is Europe's bloodiest period of history, most violent. Like all of the horrible violence that we usually associate with the Middle Ages is actually the period following the Middle Ages.
Yeah, the 20th century was kind of rough too.
Yeah, that's a different kind of
Rough.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I keep picking on this. Yeah, I want to turn to Aaron for a few comments on the one church, but I'll also say, like, when it comes to discussions, when somebody like identifies, look, this church right here, this is the one that's the one true faith. It bothers me for the reason that I've laid out. That's like, look, you're still existing within the division.
Right.
Like leaving this church over here where you thought you were the best ever, and then joining this church over here where you think you're the best ever is not a change. When I find I'm not nearly as bothered when Orthodox people will say something like orthodoxy is the fullness of the faith. I can, and partly it's because I can look at my tradition and see there are some good and true things that my tradition is not big enough to include.
Right.
And that's not I don't see that as a condemnation of my tradition, as long as I've got a humble view of as like my tradition is not being at the top and like the king of the world and whatever, like because there are some expressions of Christianity that are not going to have a place in an Orthodox monastery, for example.
Right.
So like within smaller bodies, you won't have what you might call the fullness of the faith. And so you might say, like in the Mennonite or Anabaptist tradition broadly, like it doesn't matter how much up the chain you go, you're not going to find an Anabaptist tradition that can include all of the faith. And I think, again, something like orthodoxy, you can make a better argument that you might say, like, look, my individual church doesn't include the fullness of the faith, but like if you go up the chain, you'll find a place for everything that could be Christian has a home somewhere.
Right.
So like I say, that kind of language doesn't bother me so much, but the idea of like, look, this is the true faith, it's like it's just the same old exclusionary attitude, and you're just coming up with a way of justifying it.
Yeah, and like that's the weakness of like the online apologetics scene, and like even in my own videos, like it's too easy to come off polemically, like I'm just arguing against why everybody else is wrong, and come off as like I'm just this big jerk who thinks everybody else is just wrong about everything, and they need to like come to their senses and believe what I believe. Like you can too easily do that. That's why I like this discussion better.
It is way better.
Well, it is. Like the only reason I did those videos was to keep content going.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
did fine.
this guy was off doing his thing.
You did fine.
He's being real nice now that we're on the video.
Yeah, you should have heard what he was saying earlier. But it's like, you know, my experience on the ground with you know, priests and Orthodox clergy is very much like, oh no, don't go out there saying everybody else is wrong. Don't go out there saying we're the only ones that got it right.
Well, and I think also this is like the axe is already at the root of the tree. Don't think to say that we have Abraham as our father. Like,
right, yeah.
You know, like that exactly is the mentality that I hear when I hear this idea of like we're the one true church.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, great.
Yeah,
and
like
John the Baptist wouldn't have been impressed.
I hear a lot of criticism from priests I know about a lot of the online Orthodox personalities, especially like the more, I guess you would say, argumentative ones. It's like, well, this is not Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
This is not what we're about. But a lot of people are getting the impression, and then people are coming into the church with that, I don't know, that kind of baggage.
Yeah.
And like you got to like retrain them.
Yeah. Right.
Well, I would say for me, my greatest respect for the Orthodox Church and how it approaches things and how it has strived to maintain the Church of the Apostles has not come from Orthodox apologetics. it has been from observing the fruit that the church has produced and the people that advocate for it, I would say, by the lives that they live, and
Right.
that in and of itself has been much more of an advocate for the church, for the Orthodox Church, than anything else.
Yeah, which I think that's actually like a good point as to why I advocate for the necessity of an institutional church, is because if you don't have an institutional church, all you have is apologetics and polemics. Like all you can do is argue with other Christians about who's right and who's not.
Yeah, right.
But if you have an institutional church, it's like you don't have to do that. Like that's something I've noticed about myself. Is like, hey, I can relax.
Well, yeah. Instead of arguing in the polemics and apologetics and all that, then you can just say like, "Come, take and eat."
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Right.
Or it's like, the Orthodox are big in pointing out, it's like, well, the message, I don't remember which apostle it was, the message that he had to whoever it was. I should remember the story. I'm sorry I don't. Maybe one of you does. But this apostle encounters somebody else, and his message to him is, come and see.
Yeah.
It's not to like lay out. He doesn't like sit down and open up the Torah scroll and make this concise argument for why Jesus is the Messiah. It's like, hey, no, come and see.
Right.
Like, come and see for yourself.
Yeah. And my comments here, I think you guys understand well the position that I'm laying out here. Just for the sake of any viewers, like I'm not saying this as an attack of like, hey, here's the problem with orthodoxy.
Right.
I'm talking about a specific mentality that does exist in every kind of church and every individual person. And some people use orthodoxy to justify a very specific sin.
Yeah.
Which again is like, I'm not accusing the church of being guilty of that, or the teachings of the church of making that mistake, but like just for there are individuals nevertheless who are making that mistake, and it's something that's kind of has too big of a place in this trend of orthodoxy. And when I say trend of orthodoxy, I'm not representing that negatively either. I think that's a very positive trend. But there are cautions to be aware of within it.
Now, and I would point out with that, and this would actually be a good point. I know there's a handful of priests that watch our videos, for you to weigh in on the comments. My impression is very much that the Orthodox Church actually does not have a definitive stance on how I guess you would say the heterodox, how the Protestants and even the Roman Catholics relate to the church. That there's a variety of interpretations as to whether or not they're separate, whether or not they're in schism, whether or not they're heretical bodies that are just completely cut off, or whether or not they're still part of the church in some way. Like there's a variety of different.
And then again, if they are cut off from the institutional church, then what does that mean?
Yeah, like what does that mean? Like, but yeah, so my impression is like there's not like a cut and dry statement that these people are bad. There's some people that is like definitely like, yeah, these ones, like, oneness Pentecostals, it's like, no, they're just heretics. But yeah, that's just my understanding. It's like there's not like this cut and dry, in and out kind of mentality. I think some individuals have that, but like the church as a whole is kind of like, what's the position of the Bishop of Rome in relation to the Orthodox Church? Well, ask 5 priests and you'll probably get 5 different answers.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it's I think in a sense it's a dangerous question to land on an answer to, because I mean, sort of what I'm saying is like, once you have the answer to that question, then you've got a wedge that you can use against everybody else that doesn't agree with you.
Well, and then you start to go down the road of whether or not, defining how God will bring salvation to certain people or a certain group or something like that. You start to go down the road of getting into defining that yourself too, which is very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I think salvation and the meaning of salvation is actually really important to the discussion that we're having, and I also feel like like it's it'll double the conversation if we try to talk about what does it mean that
Right.
salvation would be found in the church.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other?
Well, I would just love if you got any other comments about like
Yeah, you haven't really
the
talked
one
much.
the one true church and any of this.
Well, I mean, I think I made my position clear when I talked about, seeing the fruits of what's being produced is pretty meaningful for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I also related it a lot to, talking about the kingdom of heaven being present here and now and not being some far off distant thing. That's something that's really important to me when it comes to considering the church and what it is. Like, is the church that, okay, we'll just say is the church group that I'm a part of meaningfully trying to manifest or bring about the manifestation of the kingdom of heaven in the world around them? And is the church that we are a part of, is it bringing me to a place of understanding that the world around me is bigger than just me and myself? And obviously, is it drawing me to Christ? And it's a little easier to see through the fog sometimes when you start to look at those different things, I think, instead of like David mentioned, doctrine and things like that. Well, doctrine can be important sometimes, but man, if you start getting into the weeds too heavily on it, then you really start to miss the meat and potatoes of. Right. You start to miss the table, as David described. And yeah, I mean,
you were saying meat and potatoes. And
yeah,
and it's like the substance, the thing that you're taking in, and is
right
actually nourishing you.
Yeah, and I just think that I mentioned earlier being part of a group that separated from another group at one point in my life, and knowing the consequences that fall from that, knowing the consequences that lay themselves out from that, and for myself.
And you're in an interesting position now where you're like no longer a part of the church that you were pastoring before,
right?
For doctrinal reasons for beliefs that you held that actually didn't have anything to do with what was happening in the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and to know that, like, it's important for me that I don't try to completely separate myself from what happened. Like, just basically say that doesn't exist anymore in my consciousness or my life or my view of things, or those people are not people that I know anymore, don't want to acknowledge anymore.
No, I was glad to see lots of them at the wedding and participating in it as well.
Yeah.
And people that I know that there's been some specific division.
Yeah.
That we're still contributing, not just sitting there as a part of it, but that we're helping you with it.
Right. Yeah, and so I guess I would say, from the experience that I've had, leave the door open. Leave the door open to someday someday the relationship's being mended, or someday reconciliation may be happening. Like, bring that out into church situations as well. For all three of us, we grew up in the Anabaptist circles, and one of the biggest struggles for the Anabaptist circles is the thing of separation, the thing of shunning, the thing of pushing away, the thing of rejecting, and basically, you are no longer allowed to be part of my life anymore ever again. That type of thing is something that is a huge problem for the Anabaptist culture. And like David said, we can see the constant breakdown, we can see the constant disintegration of things, and we know that that's not the way it should be. We know it should not be that way. We know it's not right. But yeah, just to take on accept a place or accept a position of humility when it comes to the approach of these things, and to accept that I am not right about everything, and I'm wrong about some stuff, no doubt, and that's okay. I think all of us probably are. But yeah, I don't know if you want to critique anything I said.
No, I think it was good.
Yeah. Anything else, John?
No, not really. Just in conclusion, Dave was wrong about all kinds of things. I just can't remember what they are right now.
Just, I guess, maybe just to close the video, we just decided to make Dave the scapegoat, I guess.
That's fine. I got broad shoulders.
Anyway, thank you so much for being with us again. We love your participation as always. Keep that going. If you have an experience such as church difficulty or anything that might inform the conversation or bring encouragement, bring a challenge to everybody, share it within the bounds of reasonability. Don't put anybody in the line of fire if necessary, I guess I would say, but yeah, offer those experiences as well. Because if one thing we all know is that division causes division within our hearts, and it causes turbulence in our lives, and it's not the way it's supposed to be. So yeah, your experiences too will contribute to this conversation. But as always, like, comment, subscribe, share, anything and everything. Thanks for being with us. We love and appreciate all of you, and we wish you peace in Christ.